My name is Klein, and I'll be teaching a course on political approaches to international conflict. In my course, people will be learning a variety of theories and then applying them to real-life case studies. So we start with overarching theories of realism and liberalism, and we move on to bargaining theory, negotiation theory, and the combinations of how those work and how they play out on the international field, including even domestic constraints on those negotiations. Then we end up with ideas of democratic peace theory and reconciliation. I think students get a very good grounding on negotiation theory and international bargaining, and that allows them to be able to apply those skills when they are assessing real-life situations and international conflicts, civil wars, anything that involves those kinds of violent conflicts, as well as even things like trade wars and negotiating economic agreements. What constitutes success? When we talk about third-party intervention, what exactly are we trying to accomplish? When there is a conflict going on between two parties and outside parties get involved, are we getting involved because, do we measure success because they manage a quick cessation of violence? Or do we measure success by the imposition of a more equitable solution? But the research is ambivalent about whether or not that makes a difference. I mean, so the results here were saying that the regional interveners did not necessarily bring more success than the United Nations did. I think the idea sounds right, but what we also have to remember, though, is that the essence of a third-party intervention, right, is that when you have a conflict between two sides, right, you have a dyadic relationship. And the moment that you add in a third party, okay, so then there's a trilateral relationship going on about how how they relate to each side. And so there's going to be multiple interests. There are more possibilities of what can happen because each side here has to agree on the third party. So for example, if we use Sri Lanka, India had tried to impose themselves as a third party, which Sri Lanka liked as the government, but the LTTE did not like. In the year 2000 or 2001, when there was talk about trying to bring in a third party, the British were actually interested in being a third party. Now the Indians had failed. The Indians were a regional group which was seen as someone who should have influence on both sides, but they were ultimately rejected. When the British came in, the Sri Lankan government liked the idea of having it, and the rebels didn't. Partly because they saw that the British being as this colonial power, they were afraid that the British would try to impose some kind of a settlement. And so, in the end, who became the third party that intervened in that conflict was Norway. Okay, why Norway? Why was Norway accepted as the third party? Well, they would only be a facilitator. They could not impose a solution on either side. And both sides were happy with it that way, that there would be no way to force it, that they would agree to a ceasefire. So the ceasefire, even though it was facilitated, you could say there was a third-party intervention without which they couldn't have reached a ceasefire, but at the end of the day, the enforcement fell upon the two parties. There was no third-party guarantor that peace agreement would stay. And as pointed out by Toft, she points out that one of the problems when you have a negotiated settlement, this is why she was making the case for rebel victory, is that when you've got this agreement that's essentially bilateral, even though it looks like it's been mediated, but no one has a veto power on it, so no one can enforce it. And so when one side starts to violate, the other side at first they don't want to strike back because you feel obliged to keep up with the spirit. That also happened after Oslo in 1993, when there was a wave of terror, that even though there was violence continuing, you feel, well, let's give a little more time, let's show a little more trust, let's give a little bit of leeway. But eventually, that breaks down, and the temptation to cheat, when we start looking at the prisoner's dilemma again, and the other side starts feeling, well, listen, look, if I cheat, I actually can gain a little bit more at the expense of my opponent. Cheat, you cheat, you cheat, you cheat. Eventually, you hit a red line. You don't know when you've hit that red line, but once you do, then it all comes back to you, and then the violence resumes.